Welcome to Make Something with me, Jonathan Katz Moses. Today I'm going to show you an easy way to get started with dovetails. Check it!
Before we get started with this tutorial, I just wanted to let you know that this is a longer video at about 25 minutes full of awesome tips and tricks and a great introduction to hand cutting dovetails by Jonathan Katz Moses. I'm releasing another video at the same time that's much shorter and condensed where I cut the same dovetails. The point of the shorter video is for quick reference so you can come back as a refresher. I don't cut dovetails very often, and when I do, I need a cheat sheet, so that's the purpose of releasing two videos at once. I'll have a link to it up above and at the end of the video and down in the description. All right, Jonathan, take it away.
Because we're making a dovetailed box today, I wanted to show you some essential tips and tricks that I learned when I was a beginner that really helped me get better at dovetails. First step is just to mark out your depth line, and you do that by marking the depth of your opposite board.
So you have two boards here.
Right.
Just to show on the camera, we have two boards.
And so the depth of your opposite board is the depth from there to there. So what I always do is put my marking gauge on there and slide it down to the other board, and then you can just mark it off. We're going to do our tails first, so we mark out our shoulders, because there's always a half pin, but there's a gap on the tails.
Can you tell me why you're using a marking gauge and not a pencil?
Very sharp line gives you a place to rest your chisel, rest your saw, and get right in there. But if you do it with a pencil, it's not going to be exact. And this kind of joinery needs exact. And this is our pin board. So we just do the two sides. And then it's important to label the outsides of your boards, and then also label where the corners go together. So we've got A and A there, which means they're going to go together like this. Then we mark out our tails. So we're going to do our tails board, outside tails, outside pins. So we've marked out our boards. A really easy way to lay out your tails, which I always cut first, without having to measure, is take a set of dividers, and I've already figured out what works for me, but usually I just use trial and error. And I start on one edge, I make a hole, make another one, and then when I run out of board, I go start back at the other side, make a hole, make a hole, make a hole, and then I run out of board, and then I take my marking knife and my combination square, and I stick it right in the hole and slide the square up to it. Always slide your square up to it, so that way you get right in the right place. Mark it out. Same thing here. And a little time saver, when you run out of room to hold your square, just flip it around and do the inside. Now it's important to mark out your waist, and in this case, waist is going to be the pins. Now it always looks better, David, when pins are smaller. Aesthetically, that seems to be what's pleasing to the eye. So as you get practice, you make your pins smaller and smaller. And then, with the outside of the board facing me, I'm going to cut out my tails.
Okay, you have this saw right here.
It's a Japanese pull saw, which cuts on the pull stroke. This one here, this is a Western saw that cuts on the push stroke. And you can see the kerf for the Western saw is much thicker than the Japanese saw. So I prefer the Japanese saw for a few reasons. One, it's much less expensive, so getting into the dovetail game, it's a lot cheaper point of entry. Okay. Two, they're disposable. They're about $37. In fact, there'll be a link in the description of this video to an Amazon one you can get on Amazon that's great. That's the one I use. It's the one you see here. And so they're disposable. When they get dull, you can just get rid of them and get a new one. But if you want, you can order replacement blades. There's a thinner kerf, so any mistakes are not compounded. The thicker the saw, the bigger the mistake. Okay. So I like these. They also work great with the jig because they have a deeper throat to them. Deeper than the Western saw. Yeah, so you can see that this, you get a lot more room, which means you can cut deeper on your dovetails with a guide. So what I do, I like to think of it like my neighbor's yard, and the marking gauge line is his fence. I can touch the fence, but I can't go over. Okay. So what I do, I start with my saw right on the line. I do a little bit of a backward stroke just to kind of get it into place.
And backwards with the Japanese saw is pushing.
Right, and with a Western saw it would be pulling. And then I slide the jig up to it, making sure the jig is flat on the workpiece. I look through the jig to make sure I'm not in the wrong place, and then I just go down to the line. I like to get to the line closest to me first. So I tilt the slaw, and then I look over, and if I'm not quite there, I just pull it slowly until I hit that line perfectly.
Gotcha. And from what I understand is we're not going to go right on down the line. We're going to do all the cuts that go this way.
Correct.
First. Then we're going to come back and do the cuts that go at
Yes, and we're going to turn our board around because it would be a lot tougher to hold the saw backwards like this.
Okay.
So we're going to do all the cuts on one side. And also, even if you're doing it without a jig, that works a lot better because your body is always at the same angle.
Yeah.
And you're not trying to switch back and forth, back and forth.
You got that muscle memory.
Right, you don't lose that muscle memory. So same thing, a little bit of a backward stroke to get it in the right place. And I use my thumb to hold it where it needs to go so it doesn't slip. Slide the jig up, making sure I'm in my waist. And I get down to my line first. And I look over, pull it through down to the line.
Perfect.
Yep.
Every time.
Every time. That's just such a great thing about using a guide. It really takes the margin of error out of it. Same thing, slide the jig. Just like that, we're gonna flip our board around. Start with our thumb, a little bit of a backward stroke to get it in the right place. Same thing. And same thing. Now, we're going to use our coping saw to clear out the waste. And great thing about any coping saw is when you turn it sideways, this is like a level plane. So as long as this is straight, your blade's going to go straight. You want to get close to the line but not go over, just like you don't want to go into your neighbor's yard. And the more you remove without going over, the less chiseling you have to do, and the cleaner your dovetails are going to look. Okay. We're using a 20 TPI blade because it makes much tighter curves and is easier to clear out more waste than with, let's say, an 11.5 TPI blade. So we take our coping saw, we get just above our line, and we turn as we pull, and just cut over the line, just like this. Same thing. And again, we want to keep this flat with our marking gauge line, just like that.
But we're not touching the line.
We're not going into our neighbor's yard. And then we're going to cut our shoulders, which we do with the 90 degree crosscut shoulder side on our jig. So we go a little bit of a backward stroke, not going into our neighbor's yard. And this is a cut you want to do slowly. The saw is going to react much differently than it has been when it's been doing a rip cut. Now you're doing a cross cut. So you're not going to be used to the speed, and usually you're pretty close. So you don't want to go too fast. You're going to cut into your first tail. And then I just like to give it a little wiggle when I get close, which will pop it off. Just like that. Flip it over, do the same thing. Sawing is a lot like playing pool. Just like in pool, you want only your arm to swing like a pendulum. You do not want a lot of body movement. As long as just your elbow's moving, you're going to saw straight. So then, using a piece of scrap, we're going to clear out a waste. And as you can see here, we got very close with our coping saw, so we don't really need to clean out much. But I'm going to take a little bite out of there just to clear out so we're not chopping a bunch. Because what happens with chisel, when you're chopping down, this angle is going to force it back behind your line. And you don't want to do that with joinery. So, take the appropriate size chisel. And we're going to use our hammer. Please don't hurt them, hammer. And just chop that out. Now, when you're not chopping to your line, you don't have to worry about it too much. But I always start with my show side, my outside of my box, when I chop down to my line. That way, once that's out of the way, you don't have to worry about blowing that out from the back. Eric. No. So just like that, we chop about halfway through when we get down to our line. Just like that. You can see we're down to our line, and then we flip it over. Same thing. Sorry, camera. Just like that, and I can feel we're just about through, so we do the same thing here. Chop out our waist. Show side first, then back side. I'm using my back hand as the gas and my front hand as the brake. So that way the chisel doesn't get away from me. It's good for safety and it's good for clean dovetails. So now we have perfect set of tails here. That's our show side, everything. And you can see, I say perfect, but the inside's a little blown out, but because nobody's ever gonna see that, so we're not worried about it. It's something that sometimes people get a little stressed about is the whole thing has to be perfect, but it doesn't. Just the part that shows.
We have our dovetails now, so now we have to cut the pins. Correct. So what do we do for that?
So now that we've cleaned up, so cleaning up is going to help you too, because finding your tools makes cutting dovetails a lot easier. But what we're going to do is mark out our pins, and there's one of two ways to do it. This is a dovetail alignment board that I made for David actually, and the way it works is you can lock this into your vise, and it keeps the boards perfectly aligned. Now this is a luxury.
It's got a little lip over here, right?
Yeah. This is not a luxury that not a lot of people have. So usually what I do when I don't have an alignment board is I take something like a hand plane, something I know is flat, and I lay it on my bench and do the exact same thing. Is I lock my pin board in my vise, and then I tighten it at the right height, and I'm not worried about this board yet. And then what I do is I take a square and hold it flat so that I know the two boards are aligned. And then you just take your marking gauge, and what I like to do, put the flat side up against your tails, and I mark all one way.
You're not putting a lot of pressure, just enough to mark the wood,
Just
right?
enough to mark the wood. Like that, and then I spin it around, and I do the other way. And when you have a dovetail alignment board, you don't have to worry as much, but when you're just holding it with your hand, you only want to do one way at a time, because that's going to keep you from having to go back and forth. So there you go. You can see our pins. Next step is to always mark your waist. Never skip that. The great thing about a jig is you don't have to mark down. Typically, you'll see people who are doing it freehand, they'll then bring their square and mark down all their lines. But we don't have to worry about that with a jig because it's going to keep it at the right angle.
Right on.
Just like with our tails, we're going to cut one side to the other. But with pins, you cut this half of the board and then spin it around and cut this half of the board. That way you're always on your dominant hand side of the jig. You're not having to switch back and forth. Now the jig has two pin sides, so it's great. You just switch it back and forth, which eliminates that need to cross your hands over. And this one you're cutting straight down. I felt it slip, so I'm just going to make sure I'm not screwing that up. And I'm going to come down to the line on my side and do that. Now if you do go over, don't worry about it. Just save some sawdust from your sanding or your bandsaw, and when you glue up, rub the sawdust in there. No one will ever see it. It covers up all mistakes. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Same thing, spin the jig around. And you see how it slipped there? So all I did was just push it back into the saw. Down to my line there. Check the other side. Good to go. Going in my waist here. Always staying in my yard, not the neighbor's. So now that we've sawn down to our line, I always put the show side facing me, the outside of the box, because that way I can really make sure I don't screw this side up. I slide my coping saw in, just sawing just over the line. Just enough to maintain that marking gauge line, but not so much that I have to clear out a ton of waste after, because this is the fastest way to remove stock. Chisels are the slowest, so I use this as my parallel guide, same as our tails. But this time you want to turn it a little bit because you got to remember that that's angled back there. Remember to maintain your angle. You don't want to cut it into your pin back there. There we go. Same thing, I always start with my show side with my chisels. And if you look closely at these, you'll see that one's good to go straight to your line, that one's good to go straight to your line. That one is too much. So I start above my marking gauge line with my hammer. Please don't hurt them. Thank you, sir. And now I can go down into my marking gauge line. And I do all this before I turn it over because we want to make sure the show side's perfect. Another great thing about the jig is when you're learning, you can flip it over and keep it at 90 degrees, just like that. And that ensures that you're at 90, perfect 90. And now we're going to flip it over. Same thing, we're going to clear out a little bit before we hit our line here. Perfect. Now a lot of times the insides will break away and that's totally fine. So you use a smaller chisel, make sure you get your show corner, and then you can just dig out in the middle and it doesn't matter because no one's ever going to see that. So we get our show corner and then clear out the rest. So we have those cleared out now. We're going to check, see how we're doing. I'm going to put this board up here and I can tell that we're close but not quite there. You can see there's a little bit of waste to clear out in our tails here. I can see that hanging out there, so I'm going to just go straight down. Be careful when you're chiseling towards yourself. You make sure you hold it tight so you're not going to slip. We're going to check this here. What I like to do is I'll give it a little tap, and I can see, you can see that our tails are breaking away a little bit right there. And so what we're going to do, we know that this has to be cleared out. So the jig is great for this. We're going to put it in there as a support board. So I can see the dent that the hammering made. So you want to get a chisel that is pretty wide. The wider the better because you want to cover your whole pins. And you want to take little bites at a time. But you let it stick to the magnet and just go straight down. So easy. It's a great way to clean it up. So now that we've cleaned up what we need to clean up, we'll check it one more time here. And if you're using, this is just a scrap piece, but since if you were making a box, you would want to check it, you would want to hit it with a caul. Make sure everything seats. And as you can see, everything is seated. There's a couple gaps right there, which we could clean up and fine tune, but I'm actually going to show you how to fix gaps after the fact, which is something I wish I had known as a beginner, because if you don't know how to tune dovetails, it's really tough to get that right. So let's glue this up and I'll show you how to fix those gaps so nobody will ever see them. The great thing about dovetails is they really are strong, so they don't need a lot of glue. And I'm going to show you a little trick here where we put glue on at the end. You can use a little scrap piece of wood or a brush to spread this around. I just like to use the tip of my glue bot to make it easier.
Are you using just the tip right there?
Just the tip. Okay. And actually what's great is this is a brand new glue bot that David just bought. And so I'm just trying to get glue all over it. Then, using a caul, we're going to use a different caul. We're going to hammer that together. Now those gaps we talked about, you can see here. So this is what I like to do. I like to save my sawdust from when I resaw or sand.
Okay.
And what I'll do is I'll clean out my sander bag and then sand the wood I'm using and keep the dust. So then I just take glue and I spread it over the joints like this. So what we do is we rub the glue in, and then with a damp paper towel, we're going to clean it off. And what that does is it puts glue just in the joints. And then we're going to take that sawdust I talked about and simply put it on there and just mash it in. And just mash it in like that. And then we're just going to let that dry. And as you can see, it's already filled all those gaps. And when it dries and you sand everything flush and then finish it, it's going to come out a perfect joint.
I'd like to take a moment to thank my top supporters this week, and that's Evan and Caitlin, Jediah Schultz, Mark Fink, Jonathan J. Katz Moses, Stephen Michutka, Jeremy Kerber, Ryan Petzold, Georgeann Reeve, Carl Brink, Glen Rossiter, Adam Beckwith, Bill Diehl, Brian McKnight, Chad Forrester, and Timothy Allen. If you want to support me and what I do, visit patreon.com/Picciuto. Over on Patreon, we give something away every week, and this week we are giving away the Jonathan J. Katz Moses jig. So head on over to patreon.com/Picciuto to find out how you can win this.
So we've sanded it, and you can see those gaps are completely gone. And I'll show you what it's going to look like with a little finish on there. Isn't that cool?
Yeah,
completely gone.
Looks perfect.
Yeah. So you can see, with a little finish, those look like perfect dovetails, and they weren't. And that's my point, is with a guide and just a little bit of trial and error, you're going to create great dovetails that you can be proud of.
Right on. You, Jonathan J. Katz Moses, are the inventor of the Katz Moses. What do you call this?
The Katz Moses magnetic dovetail jig.
So this is, we use the 8-to-1?
We use the 8-to-1, which is for hardwoods, and 6-to-1 is typically for softwoods.
Typically, but you do change it up once in a while?
I do. Sometimes if you want a more dramatic angle, I go with the 6-to-1, or I want something a little bit more subtle, I go with the 8-to-1.
Okay, so explain to my viewers the different sides of the dovetail jig.
Okay, so this has a tail side, which you can see here is the angled side. It has 2 pin sides, which makes cutting pins a lot easier. And then a shoulder side, which can also be used as a 90-degree crosscut guide. When you're using it, you can also flip it over and use it as a chisel guide to make sure you get your chisel at perfect 90 degrees.
And so, now it looks to me like this is 2 pieces of acrylic glued together and that could easily break.
It's actually polyurethane. That's the same material that pool balls are made out of, and it's poured in a mold, so it's all one piece. It is indestructible.
I set you up for that.
Right? Yeah, totally.
Yeah. I set them up, you knock them down. So,
that's how I do it.
So this thing is indestructible.
Indestructible.
And what's the advantage of having it being clear?
You can see through to make sure that you're cutting on the right side of your line. If you look through and you don't see an X, you're in the wrong place.
So in version 1, Eric, can you hand me that guy? So this is the first version that you had made out of wood.
Yep.
And what are all the things that make this better than this version?
This is not a lifetime tool. This is a lifetime tool. Mm-hmm. You buy this once, it's going to work. It may get a couple scratches, but nothing's going to hurt this thing. It's also clear, which is new. It's poured in a mold, so it's really, really accurate. You know, as you know, wood can move over time. Mm-hmm. This does not. It's poured in a mold. It's perfect.
Where can they find this?
On my website, there's going to be a link down in the description of this video.
So that's a great lesson on getting started with dovetails. Jonathan and I made this box, and we'll have a link to this. This is a little bit more of a fancy dovetail. What is this called?
It's inlaid dovetails, and it's not any harder than just doing this twice.
Check that out. How cool is that? So I'll have a link to the making of this box down below. If you're new here, you're going to want to subscribe, and you might want to hit that notification bell so you get notified when I put out new videos, which is when, Eric?
As soon as possible.
Every Thursday.
Every Thursday.
Eric's been working for me for 14 months and still doesn't know when I put out videos.
It's every Wednesday.
Anyways.
Every Thursday.
I will have links to Jonathan's work, Jonathan's channel, where you can get this dovetail jig. All the tools that we use in this video, you'll find affiliate links down in the description. As always, be safe, have fun, stay passionate, and
make something.
You had the Jonathan J. Katz Moses jig when you were getting started?
No.
Okay.
I actually did. Tell you the truth, the story of this, you don't have to record this probably too much, but I saw a video by Matt Kinney from Fine Woodworking, and that's how I got into woodworking. I was so impressed by a box that he made. I was like, I have to make a box. First thing I tried to do was dovetails. No chance. I wasn't even close. And I said, you know what, there's got to be an easier way. And so I made this little slide. It was like an angle that I cut with my bandsaw. And any person who's been woodworking for a while knows, oh, no way, you have a Matt Kinney box.
I have a Matt Kinney box.
No way.
Yeah.
This was part of his 52 boxes a year project.
Yeah.
With milk paint? No way.
Yeah.
Oh, that's so cool. I mean, he's the reason I got into woodworking.
Oh, awesome.
And I wanted to come so bad, it didn't work. And so with my bandsaw, which anybody who knows who's cut with a bandsaw, it's not a fine finish on the piece. And so I made this angled block that was at the right angle that I did with a digital angle gauge I got off Amazon for $12. And I made this thing and I used it to hold my saw. And then I said, wait, now I can make an angled guide for the other one. And I made that. And then the shoulder cut. And then I said, why don't I put magnets in it? And I said, why don't I combine them? And that's when I came up with this. It was like, I was only a couple months into woodworking, and it was because I didn't know anything that I had a fresh perspective.
Yeah.
That I was able to come up with something that was really unique, like no other guide out there. And that's the reason I was able to fit the crosscut guide and the shoulder side on there, because I just had no idea how to woodwork.
Yeah.
And so I really didn't know what I didn't know. So I got to make something completely fresh, and completely from a new start. And flash forward a few years later, we're here, and I'm in Toledo with a guy that I watched when I was learning, and it's been really fun, and it's really helped my woodworking, and I've gotten good at dovetails. And so I'd like to show you some tricks that I think are essential in taking good dovetails to great dovetails.